Good morning, everyone. We're just giving people time to get in the room. All right, we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rebecca Auger. I'm the president of the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association, and I want to welcome you to the fourth in our series, From the Ground Up, a deep dive into housing issues in Connecticut. I wanted to just give a couple of thank yous first and foremost to our program committee. I know I'm seeing some names here that were at previous workshops in this series. Our program committee did a great job putting together a really informative and thorough look at various aspects of housing and housing affordability and development potential and opportunities across Connecticut, across a variety of communities. So I want to thank Jean Davies and Evan Seaman for their work in putting this together along with the program committee. I also want to give a shout out to our government relations committee for their hard work this year in particular. It was an incredibly busy session. So especially to Emmeline, Harrigan, and John Guszkowski for all of their work and effort that they put in this past session. And we're going to hear from them today. And the focus of today's session really is around legislative updates and policies. And then I want to finally thank Robinson and Cole, our sponsor and our host on Zoom for the entire series and for their generosity and donations towards this effort. And then I finally just want to remind members of CCAPA that you should have received a member survey from our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion ad hoc committee. If you haven't had a chance to fill it out, please look for it in your email. I'm sure you'll be getting reminders, but please do respond. We are looking to have a robust response rate to that survey. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, maybe, Emmeline?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and, John, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, and I'll go ahead and get started for the first part, and then John's going to take over for the second part. Can everybody see that okay? Okay. So my name is Emmeline Harrigan. I'm the co-chair of the Government Relations Committee with our Superman, John Guszkowski. We just wanted to also give a shout out to our Government Relations Committee members. We kind of start this process with our committee members, and we rely greatly on their comments and their suggestions throughout the course of the session. We also need to give a shout out to our lobbyists, Alan Deckman and John Bailey at TCORS, who keep us well informed about what's humming at the Capitol and where things stand in committee and also in the voting and everything else. So we certainly don't do this alone. John and myself, we rely on a whole host of people. So thank you so much for being part of the Government Relations Committee. So this 2021 legislative session, I think some of you have heard me tell this story before, that I'm kind of the newest team member. So I'm the newbie to this group because John said, oh, it's a short session. Don't worry, you can get your feet wet. It'll be easy. And this has been a wild ride of a session. So who knew? But, where we start with CCAPA is, we do kind of reach out to our Government Relations Committee, and we talk about setting what are the CCAPA priorities for the year. We do this way back in December, and we talk about, well, what are the things that we had been working on in the previous years in terms of promoting legislative initiatives, and what do we see as the new priorities moving forward, given the context of where we are. And of course, when we were having this discussion in December 2020, Desegregate had already launched. Statewide GIS had been a conversation for many years. And then, of course, we had the impact and the knowledge of kind of reshuffling our work as professional planners in the state in terms of just the virtual environment, what we liked, what we didn't like. And so, of course, we also are very mindful that we have a state POCD that needs to kind of cross the finish line, that has been kind of swirling at the state for a while. And we certainly support, broader, more comprehensive planning efforts. We had some carryovers from last session, including the reorganization of 8-2, our zoning enabling statute here in Connecticut, motor vehicle and repair approvals, and then also redefining hardship for variances, among other things. But, so I just wanted to point out that, John and I don't do this alone in a vacuum. We do rely on our committee to help us kind of figure out what direction to move in. So this was a very, very busy short session. And John and I were extremely busy writing both testimony that we could submit for the various public hearings. And, we don't want to go over everything, but we do want to kind of give at least the planners throughout the state an understanding as to, how involved the session becomes for both the Government Relations Committee and then John and myself in terms of drafting testimony to submit on behalf of CCAPA. So we provided testimony not only to planning and development, but also to commerce, to housing, environment, transportation, government administration and elections. And, I would say that there were common themes in some of the things that we provided testimony on that linked back to some of the priorities that we'd established with our Government Relations Committee. Obviously, housing was a very big theme this year, transit-oriented development, virtual meetings, e-notifications, I think the silver lining of COVID was an understanding that we had the potential to change the way in which that we work. And hopefully modernize some of our alternatives for how we engage in our constituency. We also, through our membership, we also hear about different things that might be beneficial. So, for example, the testimony that we provided in February to Commerce was specifically about revolving loan funds for adaptive reuse for properties. And we specifically heard about that from one of our members. There were also some climate and resiliency bills up this year. Dam disclosure, I think, has been swirling for a couple of years. I think that finally I believe it got through the House and the Senate. So I think that's waiting for a vote. And then, of course, we had a lot of discussion about sewage disposal systems, whether we could kind of up the capacity in terms of getting additional review available, and then also, training for commissioners. I know that, I think we're in a safe space where we can talk about some of our commissioners who don't even crack open the packet before they reach the meeting. And then some, who have the best intentions, they're there in good faith. They ran, a lot of them run and are elected to this position. But, as we are trained professionals. It takes a little while to understand plans, to understand the legal context in which you operate. And I think for a lot of our folks who with good intention end up elected to boards, they don't understand that. So, I think we all felt very strongly on the Government Relations Committee that training of our boards and commissions continues to be a priority. So amongst all of the testimony that we provided, of course, I think, folks have heard about this in the news, but we had a marathon session where, John and I both signed up to testify, and, great thanks to Cristin McCarthy-Vahey, who's joining us here today, who is the chair of the Planning and Development Committee of the House of Representatives. And she, this was literally a 24-hour session. I don't know if many of you read, articles in the paper about it. The Ides of March certainly delivered this year. It was a very long, 24 hours of testimony. We submitted actually eight statements in terms of support. Some things weren't really clear, so we. But, it had to do with housing and short-term rentals, training for plan and zoning commissioners and zoning officials, ADUs, reorganizing the Zoning Enabling Act, legalizing some of the COVID initiatives related to outdoor dining, the Fair Share Bill that talks about, kind of affordable housing that should be provided regionally, locally, et cetera. And then also, an ADU bill that included discussion of middle housing and multifamily. I drew the lucky straw, and I think I logged on at 10 o'clock and was able to testify around 9:30. John drew a little bit of the short straw and had to testify at 1:30 in the morning. And of course, Cristin, she was like she was the superwoman and was there for the entire thing. I got into work in the morning and I said to my colleague, I said, well, I know John testified really late, and I turned it on and I was like, wow, they're still going. So, just an incredible session this year. So one of the things that we want to focus on, and I'm going to turn it over to John to start talking about this, is the passage of HB 6107. John, you're up.
Okay, thanks, Emmeline. And I also want to just quickly note and give a shout out to Amanda Kennedy, who is CCAPA's communication director. All of our elements of testimony have been archived on the CCAPA website, which is ct.planning.org. If you go to the advocacy section, everything that we presented to the legislature this session is up on that website. I wanted to talk a little bit about HB 6107 because it to me was not only a really, really important bill to achieve passage, but also an education for me and I think Emmeline about how a bill becomes a law and how legislature actually gets passed. And something that I did not realize, and I feel kind of stupid about this because I think this is my 5th or 6th year as co-chair of government relations, is that the chairman of the committee of cognizance, so whatever committee a bill comes out of, is basically then responsible for standing up on the floor of the House or the Senate, presenting that bill, defending that bill, and trying to seek its passage. So not only did Representative McCarthy-Vahey and Senator Needleman, who's the Senate chair, have to participate in this 24-hour session, and I think the following week was another at least 16 or 18-hour session, public hearings, but then had to take all of their priority bills, the ones that they felt most strongly about, to the floor of the House and defend them themselves. And it's not just, okay, let's everybody, hands up for 6107 or hands down. There's an incredible process of needing to understand in incredible detail these bills. And so 6107, which was initially sort of a rebirth of a priority bill that Representative McCarthy-Vahey had worked with CCAPA's help and support for the last couple of years, which reorganizes 8-2, the zoning enabling statute, carried forward and basically after public hearing became something of a vessel for a number of the other legislative proposals that came out of committee, but were not basically going to be carried forward as freestanding bills. Those being, some of the tweaks to commissioner training, some of the elements of the desegregate CT agenda. There was a tremendous effort and obviously a lot of strong feelings on every side of these issues. And it was Representative McCarthy-Vahey's thankless task as the chair of the committee, as the champion of this particular bill, to find ways to incorporate all of these various elements that were passed out of committee and considered by the legislature into a single bill, get that revised. And she did, I will say, a tremendous amount of work, working with stakeholders, working with getting advice from Emmeline, getting advice from me, getting advice from the CCAPA member, Sarah Bronin, who is also active with Desegregate Connecticut, getting input from the home builders and zoning officers and opponents of these things to try to come up with a bill that made sense, made progress, and could gain passage. And the I have having been a little bit more on the inside of this process than I think Emmeline and I, or CCAPA has been, certainly in recent history. It was tremendously eye-opening, and I have nothing but respect and admiration for the patience, the ability to master the details of this legislation enough to understand, explain, and defend them, and see this legislation through. was truly extraordinary. And Emmeline, if you want to, and I'll put, I don't think the link at the bottom works, but I wanted to point that out. Representative McCarthy-Vahey, that's the clip of you and Representative Zullo going back and forth discussing the damn bill. And so I would encourage people to check Twitter, CT Dems, and you know, Google damn bill, because it's a little bit of education about how legislative discussion happens on the floor of the House and everything being routed through the chair, but also Representative Zullo and Representative McCarthy-Vahey having a little bipartisan fun about the dam disclosure bill. So I would encourage people to check that out. It's fun. A couple of quick elements of HB 6107, which was a big bill, which was, you know, 27 odd pages, 13 sections, and a lot of big changes. As it was a little bit of a Frankenstein bill. And we will, I think, CCAPA, along with Desegregate and Casio and some of our other partners, will go into depth probably later this summer and maybe early fall about what the actual provisions are and what actions towns need to take. But I've summarized them here very brief, because we have other important speakers. This did legalize accessory apartments as of right in every residential district in the state, unless a town opts out, and it does contain basically a two-phase opt-out provision. It does. So this bill also requires ZEOs, anybody that's appointed by a zoning commission as zoning enforcement officer, will need to be certified by Casio. And for those of us who are planners that do some zoning enforcement on the side, we are working with Casio to try to find sort of an accelerated certification, if you're already AICP, to get up to speed and get your Casio certification expeditiously. But that will need to happen. As Emmeline said, commissioner training became law, and I believe actually the governor signed this bill yesterday, so this is a law now. So commissioner training, basically 4 hours every 2 years. One of those hours needs to be relative to affordable housing specifically. A lot of really positive reorganization of 8-2, just in terms of the way it reads and the way it flows, and you know, breaking up some of its ridiculously long clauses. So 8-2 now reads a heck of a lot better and makes a lot more sense. In addition, it's strengthened a lot of the language surrounding what municipalities are expected to do in their zoning regulations to proactively support fair housing and provide for demonstrated housing needs. It did change the word character, remove the very controversial word character as grounds for essentially, you know, approving or denying certain applications, because there was a long history of that word character being used to prevent, quote unquote, those people from moving into our towns. And so it was changed to the somewhat more objective physical site characteristics, which pretty much prevents the types of abuses that had been seen for years and years across many towns. The 6107 also makes clear that special development districts, floating zones, and overlay districts are legal and allowed in every municipality, because I think a narrow read of the original statute that allowed special development districts actually only allowed it technically in the city of New Haven, even though courts have sort of said, yeah, it's okay in other towns, and many of our towns do this. You know, basically every town I work for has used this in one way or another. But the statute now makes it clear that every town can make use of these important tools. There's another cap on parking. This was part of the desegregate agenda, that there'd be a cap of maximum number of required parking spaces for certain types of multifamily. That is put into effect, but it also has an opt-out similar to the accessory apartments. And then I think possibly kind of buried at the end, but something that is really important, and that I hope Representative McCarthy-Vahey speaks to when she takes the floor, is this new commission on Connecticut's development and future, which is really in the past 15, 20 years, really, I think probably the most significant proactive effort that the state will be taking to try to actually pull all these pieces together and try to plan for Connecticut's future. And I'm very excited to hear more about that. So a couple of other bills quickly. GIS was one that we have been very, very active on pushing for the last year and a half. Representative McCarthy-Vahey and Senator Needleman led this working group throughout the last summer and fall that CCAPA helped also lead, along with folks from UConn and CROG and other private sectors, and kind of an all-star cast of GIS nerds from across the state. Really put together a fantastic proposal looking at how other states manage their GIS, because as planners, you know, we don't do a very good job across municipalities, across COGs, across state departments in coordinating our GIS data, and it's long overdue. And so we put together this great bill that creates a statewide GIS office with staff, with someone in charge who is responsible for coordinating, an advisory board to help him or her, and includes a data advisory role. And this made it through the House. Incredibly, it made it through the Appropriations Committee, even with a fiscal note, because we need to hire some people to do this. The governor's office did put in funds as part of their some of the federal COVID relief funds to do some statewide data acquisition to sort of help get this statewide GIS effort up and running. Unfortunately, the Senate clock expired before it was passed finally, but we have strong hopes and that it will be included in the budget implementer, which is coming up in the next couple of weeks, and would encourage everyone to reach out to your senators and representatives to make sure that the GIS bill, which is 6647, does end up in the budget implementer. Virtual and hybrid meetings is another one that basically made it through the House, and the time clock ran out in the Senate. It didn't quite get done. In addition to allowing for virtual or hybrid meetings and making that clear that it was okay with FOI. It also included some funding for councils of governments, the allocation of funding, and sort of making permanent some of the outdoor dining. None of that happened, and we will see if it gets through to the special session or the implementer. And if nothing happens, I'm told by some of the experts that come July 1, if we don't get any guidance, we basically go back to pre-COVID meeting conditions. So please stay tuned on that and stay active with your representatives, because this is not totally gone. Recreational cannabis, we had a lot of conversations with the governor's office, who is trying to move this forward. It's a very complicated, very controversial bill, and it passed the Senate. I don't think it passed the House. And this will be taken up, according to Speaker Matt Ritter, in special session. So stay tuned on that. A couple of other bills that we tracked and that are important: 5429, which is a pedestrian safety bill that allows towns to have a little bit more control over vehicle speed on their local roads, and also, really importantly, requires the not the siting council, the State Traffic Commission, which is now not the State Traffic Commission anymore. I keep forgetting the new acronym, but OSTA. It requires them to take into account pedestrian and bicycle impacts for their traffic reviews, which I think is a really, really important step forward. And that was signed by the governor. The budget included a community investment fund, which includes valuable and much needed bond funds to bolster the infrastructure and economic development investment in our lower income communities. $1.5 billion a year for 5 years will dramatically upgrade some of our community resources, particularly in our cities. And as well as 6641, which we tracked and testified on concerning climate change, which passed both houses, and we are anticipating the governor will sign as well. As we mentioned, a couple that died. Unfortunately, the Transportation Climate Initiative, our standard hobby horse of newspaper notifications trying to go to electronic, that didn't get very far again, unfortunately. Fair share housing, as we mentioned, 6611 did not carry forward, but we raised the profile of that initiative, I think, significantly. And I think a number of communities are looking at that as a way of thinking about their affordable housing. So I anticipate that will return, and it's a very important discussion to have. Our long-awaited fix of the motor vehicle repair permitting through ZBA, is an obvious one, but this was a complicated, busy, controversial session, and not everything can happen every year. So, and again, several things from the desegregate agenda proposal did not carry forward. Although I think we will probably hear from our friends at the CHRO that those recommendations are still very much needed and may return. So with that, and apologies for going too long, we'll just put our contact information. Emmeline and I are always available to answer questions. We always welcome new members, political junkies, policy wonks. We welcome you all. We welcome your comments, and we thank you for your participation in the session this year. And with that, I will ask our friend Representative McCarthy-Vahey to talk a little bit about her experience this session and what she's looking forward to, other than rest.
Well, good morning, or is it afternoon or evening? I'm not sure. It's really nice to be here with all of you. And I have to tell you that I do wish that I was in person with you in that wonderful conference room in Hartford and gathering to eat lunch together and all that. I think that it's pretty obvious based on the presentation that you just heard that it was a really full session. And some of us were remarking how almost surprising it was, given that so much of our time was spent on Zoom, in Zoom hearings, and that even with that, we were able to do a lot. And I know there's a lot more to do. I was smiling during some of the presentation. I could see Emmeline smiling as well during some of them. I'm going to start with speaking of being on Zoom. And yes, this is a space you might recognize. Some of you have spent a lot of time here with me in what I call my little room. The virtual meetings bill did not make it through the Senate. It was late coming in the process, and the reason that it was late passing the House and getting filed was because it also included, as John referenced, it included some of those online notification pieces as well, which was House Bill 6641. And it also included COG funding as well as the outdoor restaurant provision. It had a lot of different pieces. Some of the holdup, and partly because it was the last day of session, so that's part of what happens, is it's a funnel. And so there are a lot of things that are getting squeezed, but people continue to have questions and concerns about how the online meeting process will work. I do think, and John, I noticed in your slide that you said hybrid okay. The only kind of hybrid that will be okay will be by telephone. Video hybrid will not be allowable once the executive order is done and if legislation does not pass. That the phone allowable is through a decades-old declaratory ruling from the Freedom of Information Commission. So it's really critical that we update our laws and put some safeguards in terms of notification. There's so much to talk about. And I think one of the things that I know John and Emmeline were hoping I would focus on, and one of the things I do want to say to all of you, is the commission that was created within 6107. And that was created in part because of the fact that there were so many things that were brought forward by a number of groups, the Partnership for Strong Communities, by Open Communities Alliance, by the planners, by Desegregate Connecticut, by advocates in the community, related to how we plan for our future, how we face and address economic development, issues of inequality and opportunity for the residents of our state. And we just weren't able to get there with all of those things. Thus, the commission hopefully taking that opportunity to gather a diverse group of stakeholders to have conversations about how we move forward. And there are some specific areas within the legislation that we want to be talking about, specifically related to how we look at alternative sewerage treatment and how that is regulated and approved, at creating model form-based codes, at how we look at the affordable housing plans that are going to be, they're now required. And John's right, the bill was signed yesterday, so it is law, that June of next year, that our communities in the state will be submitting their affordable housing plans. And how are we as a state looking at what is compliant? What kind of incentives can we provide to communities? What kind of direction? We know the Affordable Housing Plan Guidebook that our PA came up with help from some of you for certain, has been a great tool, but what other things do communities need? One of them is the GIS capacity issue. And to John's point, yes, we did pass that bill out of the House. It did not pass the Senate. And I have been having ongoing conversations about if it didn't pass the Senate, could it be included in the budget implementer process? Because indeed, budget funds were included. So it would be a natural, very direct tie-in to implementing the budget and having that policy behind it. I know there's so much I can talk about, but I just want to say, it's great to be here with, what I would call my people, because so many of the bills that we address and deal with in planning and development are clearly in our name, planning, and the work that you all are doing, every day is so, so important. So I know I could talk about a lot of different things. I don't know if you, John or Emmeline, have specific questions, or if members of the group have questions, happy to address those. But I do want to add one last thing, which is when John and Emmeline share their contact information and say that they're available, I just want to tell you, they have been incredible allies. They have been available to me at all hours of the day and night and the middle of the night, as you heard, just really educating me and helping me to understand what happens on the ground for all of you when you're working in the communities that you're in, and how things have that direct impact. So I just want to thank the two of them for their incredible work as well.
So I have a quick question for Representative McCarthy-Vahey, but I wanted to just underscore that and say that I feel like we have successfully built over the last several years very good relationships with our friends at the legislature, mostly by being the resources that we are as planners. And I just, as this is a gathering of planners, make it clear that your expertise, your experience, and your input is incredibly important to the legislative process. And it's been gratifying that is increasingly recognized and increasingly called upon to inform the direction of legislation and how bills proceed, how bills are written, and how they will hit the ground. Some of the conversations that I had, that Amanda Kennedy and I had with the governor's office concerning cannabis made it clear, unfortunately, that there are some fundamental misunderstandings from the executive branch about how planning and zoning happens at the local level, and being known as expert resources and truth tellers and ground truthers is a really valuable service that we provide, and it only happens because we develop a level of trust with the legislature. So I think we need to keep that up and continue to build that. So in terms of continuing to build, I would just want to maybe put Representative McCarthy-Vahey on the spot and sort of thinking forward, because there's a number of things, unfortunately, unbelievable amount got done given the circumstances. What would you look forward to? What was still left on the table that you feel like should be brought back, and we shouldn't leave these discussions on the wayside?
Well, I will reference the rest factor. It's the last week of session, working to try and get through as much as we could. And I will say planning and development, we were successful, probably more so than a lot of the other committees, in large part because of the kind of partnerships we've had with your organization and with others as well. I think that the virtual meeting piece is and the online notification, the COG funding, those are real immediates. That was the 6448 bill. The the outdoor dining piece of that bill, which is the fourth portion, is important. And I know it's important to the restaurant industry, but it's not as pressing a need as some of those other things. So I think, that's when I think about kind of the immediate moment, that will have some pretty immediate impact, not just for planners, but for all town bodies who have been taking advantage of this. And we all hope and are very encouraged by the direction of the numbers in terms of our positivity rate and our fatalities and our hospitalizations. We're in a great place and hopefully we can stay there. But as I've said many times, we've opened a Pandora's box, and there have been a lot of wonderful things that have come of our need to innovate. I think it's kind of hard to just close that box. So that's an immediate conversation. I know that when we passed 6107, there were some folks who were very excited and others who were very upset. And when I say upset, that's those who were opposed to the bill in its entirety all the way through, as well as those who were supporting some of the other concepts. And I think that, as I've said to many people, as long as there are humans on the planet, we will be talking about land use. And that means we'll be talking about zoning. It's a necessity. These issues that we're facing, whether it's about economic development, whether it's about equality of opportunity, whether it's about climate change and coastal resiliency, they're all impacted by zoning. So we will need to continue to take the work of the commission and the work of all of the different advocacy groups to continue to look at what the best solutions are. When we think about, at some point there will be an end to the moratorium on evictions, for example. When we put things in place this year to help protect homeowners in terms of foreclosures, additional protections. But again, the long-term effects of COVID are yet to be seen. So I do think that's going to be important. Newspaper notifications, that is an issue that comes up on a regular basis, and it really needs some time and compromise. And what I'll say about so many of these issues is that there are capacity issues, and the more help and support we have in working through some of those issues is what allows us to be able to accomplish more, because the legislative process is by definition a negotiation and working to come to the best compromise possible. So I will say too that GIS is an area that John and I have spent a lot of time talking about. And I'm with a group of people who understands how important GIS is. As with so many of the issues that we address, there are foundational issues that most people don't know about. I mean, most legislators even, what is GIS? Why is that important? What does it mean? We need to continue to build the foundation in our state to support the work you're doing out in communities and in COGS to help leverage resources and create that kind of supportive structure that is a resource. So I think there's so much. I know I'm a little bit all over the place, but there are so many pieces of what we didn't do this year. And just looking at your agenda, just the motor vehicle piece, for example, some of those, what I'm going to say, smaller things to really the big issues around housing opportunity, economic opportunity, climate adaptation, and more. They have to stay on the table each and every session to the best of our ability. We're going to need to continue to move forward.
Okay. Thank you, Representative McCarthy-Vahey, not only for your participation today, but your outstanding leadership and patience and perseverance with the Planning and Development Committee. We are very grateful as planners to have you representing our thoughts and priorities at the legislature.
Well, thank you. It's teamwork. It's always teamwork.
So I'll move on to the next portion of our presentation, which for some of you who sort of followed process in the legislature and have been aware of Desegregate Connecticut efforts for the last year, and how House Bill 6107 evolved, might have been maybe bemused by the interesting timing of the issuance of a report entitled Connecticut Zoning and Discrimination 2021, which was prepared by the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities, which is a statewide commission established by the state back in, I think, the 40s. And their job is to monitor discrimination and opportunities across the state. And this report was basically dropped, I think, either the day before 6107 passed in the House or the day after, and a couple of days before it passed in the Senate. It was curious, to say the least, and I think probably not entirely coincidental. But it's a very interesting report and very timely. And so we wanted to give some of the co-authors an opportunity to present their findings, particularly in the light of what ended up passing the legislature and what was left out of some of those bills. So I'll turn it over to two of the co-authors and members of CHRO, Spencer Hill and Jody Walker-Smith. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us. Again, my name is Spencer Hill. I'm an attorney with the CHRO, and I'm joined by Jody Walker-Smith, a fellow attorney. Thank you for that introduction. The CHRO, we have been around since the 40s, and our primary mission is really to eliminate discrimination in throughout the state. We do a lot of different kind of things in our agency. We focus on employment discrimination, public accommodations discrimination, but one of the things that we are particularly focused on is housing discrimination. Again, our goal is to eliminate discrimination throughout the state, and housing discrimination is really so fundamental to discrimination in all aspects of life. Where you live impacts what services you can access, where you can work, and how easily you can work. So one of the things that we really wanted to focus on this session is really diving into looking at in a bit more detail and kind of shedding a light on how discrimination really works on the housing level through zoning regulations, because once we can kind of tackle that issue more effectively, that's going to have ripple effects on kind of discrimination, racial discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination, familial status discrimination, in many different ways, kind of throughout society, if we can kind of work on this one piece. So that is kind of why we wanted to start working on this session. Again, we also know that there are other groups who have brought a renewed attention to these issues in Connecticut, and we are so grateful for all of their work. Desegregate, Open Communities Alliance, many of the organizations that we've mentioned here today, and of course many of the legislatures, including those present, who have really shed a light and worked on ensuring that we really take a look at this, because it is a very important part of the discrimination puzzle in our state. I am going to try to share my screen, and hopefully I'm going to do it well. You would think that a year into this, we will be better at this, but I am going to start a little slideshow. Great, can everyone see that? Yes, I think so. Okay, great. Jody, do you want to talk a bit about the project?
So the CHRO published our report on May 24th, as was pointed out. The timing was not necessarily accidental, although we've been working on it for months. It seemed like the moment when folks would really benefit most from hearing our voice and joining our voice in this conversation. The report analyzes the state's various zoning regulations and the resulting segregation throughout the state because of those zoning regulations. It provides an overview of our exclusionary zoning policies and the lack of affordable housing in the state, and the intersectionality of housing segregation and its impact on education and health equity, and also includes a summary of relevant case law, recent court cases. As I'm sure everyone is aware, Connecticut's one of the most racially segregated states in the nation. And we thought it was very important to bring to the conversation the fact that that didn't happen by accident, and that it was actually a result of conscious choices. And those choices are still within our control. So while some of the most extreme policies and practices that resulted in that segregation have been outlawed, segregation clearly still persists today. And our report recommends that the state find multifaceted solutions to allow people to find affordable housing where they want to live. It's about choice. Our report is not recommending that everyone that is living in low-income communities should or can or should be required to move. Our report is addressing the lack of choice and the lack of options based on choices that we've made in this state. And so we want to ensure that the state is investing in communities where Black and Latinx people are currently living, and makes various policy recommendations, including eliminating zoning bans on multifamily housing and accessory dwelling units, eliminating excessive requirements for lot size, setback, height, parking, and density, regionalizing education funding to distribute education resources more equitably, requiring racial equity to be considered in the development of municipal affordable housing plans, and creating a scheme where each town is responsible for a fair share of affordable housing, including housing for families, in addition to affordable housing reserved for older people and people with disabilities. Our report really attempted to highlight the intersection of social identities that are impacted by restrictive zoning practices, and also the intersection of oppressive systems and how they contribute together to create a situation where Black and Latinx residents in Connecticut are disproportionately trapped in poverty in neighborhoods that they do not have the choice and are specifically under-resourced, underfunded, over-policed, and have underfunded schools, and significant health disparities, as has clearly been shown during the COVID pandemic.
Yeah. So what we're going to kind of do is kind of just go through the different parts of the report, and kind of just starting with an overall kind of just summary of what is in the report and some of our more key findings. Again, one of the things that this report is really focused on zoning regulations and how these regulations kind of impact discrimination more broadly. But it is, again, very important as we kind of talk about all of these things, that many of these choices, these policy choices, are perhaps unintentionally having disparate impacts, affecting different communities differently, but they are ultimately choices, and these choices get kind of baked into the regulation system that is in our state, that does place barriers to integration. Again, it's not something that, again, we're not saying that anyone is necessarily sitting there saying, how do we keep out these undesirable groups? But although sometimes that does happen, but again, these zoning regulations that do have an impact on keeping people out. They are a choice. It's a policy choice, and the only way to address that and to reduce segregation in Connecticut is to make meaningful reform to residential housing policy. That's kind of the overall takeaway, is that these policies do have an effect, that they have ripple effects in other parts of our lives, and that the only way we are going to address this issue meaningfully is by taking a real look at how we operate and making meaningful reform. just kind of as a historical point, the commission has always kind of been engaged in this. We've issued previous reports on this topic, going as far back as 1978. We issued our first commission report kind of looking at zoning regulation problems, and dishearteningly, many of the kind of issues that we found in the 1978 report persist today. And we're going to be talking about several of those kind of mechanisms that are still ongoing, but this is not a new problem in Connecticut. This has been a problem as far back as kind of the state has existed, that there has been some intentional and unintentional barriers to desegregation put into our state. Again, I don't think I need to remind anyone that civil rights is having a new moment in the world, in the nation, and in Connecticut. COVID, and again, we'll dig a bit more into how COVID has kind of exploded some of the divisions in our society, but COVID has been a pressure cooker. We've seen the protests of the last summer after the now murder of George Floyd. We've seen all of these things, and there's a real reckoning with the fact that the current way of doing things is not equal for everyone, that the experience faced by our more privileged citizens is not the experience faced by everyone else. And it's not that people are choosing to live in under-resourced communities. It's that there are systems in place that kind of make that the option that they have. And if we're ever going to kind of have a truly equitable society, one where people are free to have the choices to succeed or fail, that has to be part of a meaningful reform. So again, that's one of the things that we wanted to highlight in this report. Jody, do you want to talk about intersectionality and how that plays in?
Sure. I think I covered it a little bit, but our report attempts to highlight how qualitatively distinct experiences of people living at the intersection of overlapping systems of oppression can create multiple layers of challenge. And so there are a disproportionate number of Black and Latinx residents in Connecticut who are also low income. This is probably not new information to anyone here, but also there's a disproportionate number of single females of heads of household. And there are intersections between age and disability and race and ethnicity. And when those things come together, it's not that a person experiences two different and distinct ways of being oppressed. Those social identities are merged, and that intersection of that identity merging is what is experiencing the different systems which disadvantage those same groups. And so our zoning policies disproportionately disadvantage Black and Latinx residents of low income, and female heads of household. It's important to note that more than 2/3 of Black and Latinx residents in Connecticut live in just 15 of the 169 cities and towns in Connecticut.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, these are the result of this is we no longer have necessarily overt segregation policies from the 1960s, but it is important to recognize that government policies, including planning and zoning regulations and decisions, are government actions that can lead to segregation. And again, we're not saying that it is always even intentional. Sometimes, you are prioritizing different things, but when that comes at the expense of certain groups, that does create a problem. And again, that's something that we wanted to address here, to make sure that we're really creating a state where there's affordable and accessible housing for everyone, that there are options, and not just the mere absence of housing insecurity, that we're not just addressing homelessness, we're really, it's about improving choice, ultimately is what we're trying to talk about.
I think it's also important to understand that equity, in order to talk about any kind of equity, you have to consider historical implications and what has come before. So while there isn't de jure segregation, where there's intentional actions now by the government to segregate people, there used to be. And those same families who have, have generations of families living in different neighborhoods, it continues today. Nothing starts today. You can't look at an attempt to make things equal in a vacuum starting today, because things have not been equal and they have been intentionally not equal. So just because we've eliminated those intentional governmental levers of segregation does not mean that the effects of those are not seen today.
That's a great point, and actually harkens to one of the bills that was passed this session on removing racial covenants from housing deeds. These haven't been enforceable for decades, but they're a reminder that Connecticut is not immune. A lot of times people think of segregation as something that happened in the South, but that happened in Connecticut too, and it's important to recognize those historical impacts. So one part of our report just focuses on kind of defining affordable housing and explaining, for at least a layperson perspective, what that means. So affordable housing in Connecticut is typically defined as when no more than 30% of a household's gross income is spent on their rent or mortgage. So that really has the two components, right? It's the cost of the housing, but also the income of the person who wants to seek that housing. So when we're trying to talk about meaningful ways to kind of address that situation and make more affordable housing in Connecticut, those are really the two kind of prongs of government interventions that have been tried so far. So, for example, there's several government programs that are aimed at reducing the initial costs of building housing developments and reducing their operational costs. So it's focused more on the cost of the housing. These include grants, block grants for community development. These include specific grants for developing and maintaining affordable housing units in different parts of the state. And again, there are issues where those affordable housing grants have been kind of concentrated in our cities, which is an issue in and of itself. But there are a number of programs kind of aimed at that part of reducing the housing costs. The other part that is fairly well known is tenant-based intervention. So looking at the income of the person seeking housing. The best known is probably Section 8 housing assistance, where there are federal and state subsidies for tenants seeking housing to have a portion of their housing costs or the full amount of their housing costs covered by government subsidies, and then the individuals responsible for the remainder of the cost. These are excellent interventions that really do meaningfully improve people's lives. One of the things that we're going to talk about a bit later is that those interventions are not without their own problems. For example, Section 8 housing subsidies typically are geographically based for the first year of their issuance. So someone gets a Section 8 housing, they have to use it within a certain defined area. After that, they're allowed to take their voucher and try to find housing elsewhere. But really, once you've kind of found a place and you are living in there for a year, moving becomes that much harder, particularly for people who are low income, which is the reason they have these vouchers. All of a sudden now they have to take time off of work to go housing hunting. They have to pay moving costs, transportation costs. They have to uproot their families who may have started to establish connections to their local community. So one of the kind of recommendations we make later is just removing that initial requirement that they have a housing subsidy in a specific area, because again, it does have a ripple effect on kind of their ability to have affordable housing throughout the state. Another aspect of affordable housing is 830G, is Connecticut General Statutes 830G, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. One of the kind of key aspects of it is that when a town has less than 10% of affordable housing, and many of our municipalities do have less than 10% housing, a developer can appeal a rejection of a proposed affordable housing development plan into court. Now, again, this is actually a result of one of our previous reports. We were part of a Blue Commission report in the late 80s that kind of led to that mechanism being put in place. But the problem is that it really puts the burden onto developers to be the ones to kind of take it on, appealing the decision, bringing it into court, which is again going to add costs for the developer. It's going to add time for the developer, which are going to make the end result of the housing less affordable than they otherwise would be. This mechanism is not frequently used, and in fact, over the past 10 years, I believe that there were only less than 70 instances of a developer kind of taking this into court and getting a decision. So again, it is an imperfect system, but it is there are these mechanisms to address affordable housing in Connecticut that we hope to expand and make more usable going forward into the future.
So in this section, our social and economic development of towns, we tried to just give a snapshot. As we pointed out in our report, there are many other reports that are more detailed with statistical analysis, and that is not necessarily what our report is intending to do. We wanted to kind of give a snapshot, give some illustration of how these issues are affected throughout the state. And so we picked a mix of large cities, suburban towns, and rural towns. Specifically, I believe it was 10 of the largest cities, and then five towns or cities that were adjacent to those largest cities, and then another 5 rural cities that were scattered across the state. And what we looked at those to just kind of highlight and give a variety across the state, and to see what the differences in those locales are. And we found that there was much more multifamily housing stock, of course, in larger cities where there are more Black and Latinx residents and more poverty. We also found that there was larger housing units primarily available outside of cities where residents are more predominantly white and moderate to high income families. So that makes it difficult for low-income residents to comfortably house larger multi-generational families. And based on different cultures, multi-generational families might live together more often, and those housing opportunities are less available in the communities. We need to see more diversity, obviously, in our housing choices. The capacity to house more multifamily, single family, and large family units in all towns and cities. And our report shows that we really need to make home ownership more accessible, so families can, of course, increase their wealth. We all know that home ownership is one of the most impactful wealth drivers. And so making home ownership more accessible in all cities and towns is certainly an important step in this process. We didn't get too in depth with the population statistics, of course, but we did see that there was higher rates of female-led heads of household in more urban areas that were disproportionately Black or Latinx and more poverty. And the statistics based on race are not surprising, of course. The municipalities are more predominantly Black and Latinx residents, whereas the rural towns are more predominantly white. Want to talk? Oh, do we have the mechanics of zoning? Yes.
Yep, that should be up
there.
Yep.
Okay, great. So we also looked at, well, before I even actually get to that, of course, it's notable that our income levels, not just our family wealth disparities, but also our income levels have vast disparities that our report just highlighted based on race. But the mechanics of zoning section, we talked about how exclusionary zoning essentially has a disparate impact on Black and Latinx and Indigenous people, and has caused Connecticut to remain one of the most segregated states in the country. Unfortunately, it's as simple as that. There are restrictions that we mentioned at the outset on, multifamily housing, lot size. Obviously, the bill that was passed addressed parking mandates, although there is the opt-out. There's also ways that floor requirements and occupancy limitations and restrictions, even definitions of family, all of these ways can act, whether they were intentional or not, they can still act to exclude people from these housing opportunities. And then we just, of course, noted that public hearings that are held in order to consider whether to allow the building of any multifamily housing are often, no surprise to anyone here, I'm sure, extremely confrontational, lengthy, costly, and of course, it's important to note that they are statistically actually disproportionately attended by white male older homeowners. So the voices that are being heard in these hearings where affordable housing is being considered are not representative of necessarily even the community in which the housing will be built, let alone the people who would like to relocate to that town.
I do want to be conscious of time, and I know that we want to leave time for questions. So with regard to recent case law, I just want to point out that it is illegal for zoning regulations to intentionally exclude people of different races, but that doesn't necessarily have to be an overt act. Under discrimination law, there's really kind of two theories. One is disparate treatment, which is typically what people think of when they think of discrimination in housing, where it's a landlord saying, I don't want you based on your protected class. The other kind of theory, though, is called disparate impact. It's where you have a neutral policy that doesn't mention any protected class, but if it has a disparate impact, if it disproportionately affects a certain segment of society, that can itself be a violation of the law. For example, there was recent litigation in a Ridgefield that focused on their regulations at the time had essentially affordable housing was limited to effectively one-bedroom apartments. Well, one-bedroom apartments aren't going to be able to accommodate families, and therefore the affordable housing really wasn't affordable for low-income families or anyone kind of who needed more than one bedroom. So the courts found that this could in fact be a legal violation on discrimination grounds, even though the regulation in question had nothing to do with race or families or anything like that. But because of the mechanics of how it worked, it had that impact, unintentionally or intentionally, but it had that impact and therefore could constitute a legal violation. I think that's one thing to be very kind of aware of as planning and zoning professionals, that that you need to kind of consider the impact of policy choices on protected groups, specifically because you may not intend to have these effects, but if the policies do have them, it could lead to potential liability. So that's a very kind of important point I think we need to make. The next section of our report focuses on education, and we wanted to highlight this as a zoning issue because education is, again, just so important to all of our lives and our future generations, but it's tied directly in Connecticut to segregation and to zoning issues. In Connecticut, obviously, I'm sure many of you know about the Sheff v. O'Neill decision from the 90s that said that Connecticut schools did have segregation, that they were segregated, and that the state had an obligation to address that. The steps that have been taken have helped, but we are not there yet. There still remains extreme educational segregation throughout our state. And that is, again, tied to the fact that in Connecticut, our educational funding is municipally based. So if you have a town that is disproportionately keeping out low-income residents, that town is going to have better, more well-funded schools. and therefore people who can afford to send their kids to those schools will want to go there. And again, that's very understandable. You know, I personally live in Simsbury, which has great schools, but is also very racially homogenous. But the kind of issue is on a policy level, the more segregation that we have, the greater that there is this educational impact on students. Another thing to kind of just point out about education in Connecticut is that the funding is not necessarily equal. That studies have shown that white students or schools predominantly with white students have higher rates of funding per student on a per capita basis than schools with non-white students. Again, the resourcing issues is kind of fueling and is both a result of and causing further segregation. So as zoning is used to kind of keep families out, that has a ripple effect into education that we wanted to highlight with our report.
We also wanted to, of course, touch on COVID, given what we've all gone through the last year. And as Spencer pointed out at the outset, the COVID-19 pandemic has really forced people to see things more clearly in a way that, you know, maybe some others have been seeing all along, but we really had to open our eyes to the vast disparities of outcome and situations that our fellow residents experience. And Black and Latinx communities have been systematically disenfranchised and divested of resources, and then predictably face harsher COVID-19 outcomes. We wrote about how more often in Connecticut, Black and Latinx residents live in densely populated areas. And again, I mentioned in multi-generational or multi-family housing, where social distancing is less practical, less possible. And then also the residents in those same communities are disproportionately essential workers working, you know, grocery jobs, delivery jobs, factory jobs, where there's very likely less paid sick time and more exposure to COVID. And then coupling all of that with the underlying health disparities that Black and Latinx communities experience because of historical discrimination and pollution and various medical discrimination issues, those issues all overlap to create a situation where COVID disproportionately impacts the Black and Latinx communities. Black and Latinx residents in Connecticut were 2.5 and 2 times respectively more likely than white residents to die in connection to COVID. And that is not some indescribable statistic that we have to, how could this possibly be? There are all of these systems that are overlapping to cause that. And zoning is one of them. Black and Latinx residents in Connecticut were also vaccinated at lower rates than non-Hispanic white residents. And a rollout based on age, we said in our report, unfortunately, also disproportionately advantaged white residents, because in Connecticut, at least, white residents are disproportionately older. And so the number of people in these different age groups was disparate based on race. And so we just pointed out that, you know, the economic devastation of COVID has also had ripple effects on the Black and Latinx communities that are experiencing more poverty because of all of these systems of oppression. And the impending eviction crisis is going to, of course, impact them more as well.
Yeah, with COVID, it is really an interesting aspect in as much as the virus, none of us had immunity before the pandemic. And so on a medical level, we were all relatively equally affected by it. And so any disparities you see in the outcomes of infection, in mortality rates and things like that, can't be explained by any genetic predispositions or anything like that. It is a new virus. And the fact that there are these disparities can't be medically explained. It has to be systematically and societally explained, which is a very important thing to realize. Now, with all of these, we have, our report does make several recommendations for kind of how to address some of these issues. We have several of them, but we'll just kind of highlight a few because, again, I know we're getting close to time. One that I had mentioned earlier is to allow housing vouchers to be used in any town in Connecticut, as opposed to require they first be used in one specific place. That is kind of just a no-brainer approach. There's no particularly administrative need or anything like that, any administrative barrier to doing this. It just needs to be done. And as soon as it can, that is going to have a huge ripple effect on the ability of people using these vouchers to find affordable housing. Again, one of the parts that was part of some of the earlier legislation that was taken out is to kind of cut back on some of these excessive lot size requirements, these height requirements. Again, the parking requirement was put in there, but there is that opt-out provision. So we'd like to see that made more strict and take out the opt-out provision, because again, all of these things that may not seem like they have a disparate impact, an intentionally discriminatory impact, they do have that effect by increasing the cost of housing through increasing the time that it takes to build housing. Then that gets passed on to residents. So taking care of that kind of piece of it will really help with allowing participation in affordable housing in our state.
We also recommended that that we need to invest in education and transportation in areas where affordable housing already exists. And we need to require racial equity to be considered in the development of municipal affordable housing plans, among many other recommendations. But I know we're pretty low on time.
Yeah, so because we're low on time, we'll stop there, and we can answer questions or however you guys want to do it. How do I stop? Oh, there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Spencer and Jody. That was outstanding. I will look to Evan and Joel on how we might ask questions. There is a Q&A button on everyone's screen at the lower center of your Zoom window. Oh, we have a question from Jean. That's a good question. Would it be helpful to have more forums and discussion on how to educate towns on how to become more welcoming for desegregation to move forward? Question remains, if we build it, will towns move towards desegregation to housing stock alone? It's a very good question. I don't know, Spencer, or obviously, more discussion, more education is useful, but I'll let Spencer and Jody react to that.
Yeah, one of the kind of talking points that we often bring up is that diversity, that inclusion really needs to come before diversity, that there is that kind of symbiotic relationship, but it is not enough, in my opinion, just to build affordable housing. There has to be a kind of a change in the dynamics of each town to make them more welcome, to make them more inclusive. As municipalities kind of open up, consider these issues, and really work on making a more inclusive community, that will drive the diversity. If you build it, they will come, but only if the door is open, kind of thing. So it is an important thing to build the affordable housing, obviously, but that's not enough when really it has to be included with discussions, with efforts to make towns more welcoming to those who haven't traditionally been residents there.
Certainly, I think, not only will they come, but will they stay? And will the next people come if other people didn't stay because the town was not welcoming or inclusive? Absolutely. Forums, discussions, any initiatives to work on these issues and inclusivity and educating the public. There's so much that is implicit bias and not intentional but implicit bias impacts people every single day. And the more we can work on that, the more inclusive our towns will be.
So we had actually another question that was posted in the chat from Evan. I don't know if you folks, Spencer and Jody, you saw that. If we do look at more legislation for virtual or hybrid meetings moving forward, how do we make sure that that's accessible to everyone, or to maximize its accessibility, so we're not, unintentionally being discriminatory for technology reasons or something like that?
Yeah, well, there are a few kind of parts of that. One is that absolutely does need to happen. I was kind of shocked that there wasn't kind of unanimous agreement for that, particularly because, as we were talking about earlier, the public hearing process for planning and zoning commission meetings does tend to be representationally older white male homeowners. If you open it up and allow virtual meetings, that's going to allow participation from people who may not be able to take time to go physically to a meeting. So that absolutely does need, I think, to happen, is to have that virtual approach. But there are issues with it. In particular, internet access is still an issue in Connecticut. Many people do have smartphones with some sort of internet connection, but not everyone, and that needs to be recognized, and there need to be greater efforts at improving internet access throughout Connecticut. Another thing in terms of accessibility is making sure that closed captioning is available, or that accessibility options remain prevalent. There are certain programs, and I think Zoom is good, and some of the major ones are having improved automatic captioning functionality. But for those with audio issues, they may not be able to hear everything, and so having that caption is a key part of accessibility. And again, this as one thing that has been hard in terms of internet accessibility over the course of the pandemic is that for a lot of people, libraries, town halls, or cafes are places where they can log on to a public Wi-Fi. Again, that's something that should hopefully be fixed as we kind of reopen and get back to normal. But that has been an issue during the pandemic, where people may have a smartphone, but they can't afford internet rates, and so they've been looking for a place to go to have free internet, but that just hasn't been an option during the pandemic. Hopefully that gets solved, but it's still an issue to be mindful of.
Okay, thank you.
John, I don't know. I'm just going to chime in real quick. I don't know if you saw Renata's comment as well, in terms of how we continue to discuss some of the left out items of 1024 moving forward. So I don't know whether we have an expected calendar for next legislative session.
So that's a good question. I think the answer is we will continue this, and I replied to Renata's question in the Q&A. But yeah, the energy and enthusiasm and expertise that drove Desegregate and put together this really powerful bill hasn't gone anywhere. The entire Desegregate movement hasn't packed up and moved out of state. We are going to continue these conversations, and I anticipate that the partners that Sarah Bronin helped rally around this effort will regroup this probably late summer and early fall, and try to continue the discussion of how we carry this into both the next legislative session, but also critically working town by town to encourage towns not to opt out, because we talked about the accessory apartment provision being essentially, there's an escape hatch that towns can climb out of. And we want to make the case, and we'll need to do that town by town to make sure that municipalities stay in and allow accessory apartments to continue. So yeah, I anticipate that our work is ongoing, and at least speaking on behalf of the Government Relations Committee of CCAPA, we will continue to be an active partner in those discussions, and will solicit input from our membership. I don't know if there's another question there. Not had another question. How can we reach out and make sure our communities are better represented on our land use boards? Should we perhaps consider paying stipends? That's an interesting question to facilitate participation.
I would just jump in and say, in some places they're appointed and in some places they're elected. So I think that stipends, unfortunately, probably are not appropriate to elected people. I don't know whether, you could provide that for appointed folks, but, I think it probably depends on each municipality. I know that, of course, we hearken back to the enabling statutes. What does that allow? What doesn't that allow? What does your local code of ordinances allow? I know that when I worked out west, there were certain boards and commissions that dictated, certainly like historic preservation commissions, they dictated certain experience for those folks who sat on those boards. I have not seen that for plan and zoning commissions, either out west or in my work in Connecticut. I don't know if John wants to speak to that at all.
Yeah, no, I'll let go. I don't know if Spencer and Jody have thoughts on that.
Yeah, actually, I mean, one thing I'd just point out is to remember the kind of role of informal networks and kind of needing to expand those, particularly with regard to local elections. Local elections tend to be recruited from kind of the people who know people who are currently on there. It's relatively rare for someone to kind of just come in out of nowhere, run for a local town office and get elected to the board. Instead, that tends to be coming from civic organizations, from church organizations, informal networks between people. If we can kind of make broader efforts to reach into areas that we may not have previously engaged with, for example, reaching out to organizations predominantly inclusive of non-white citizens, that will do a lot to kind of overcome those informal barriers, because otherwise it's really just, it tends to be people joining these boards because they already know. And again, studies show that our informal networks tend to be people who look like us, resemble us. And so if you want to make an effort to get beyond that, it's really about kind of expanding your outreach efforts to include people in those networks who may not otherwise be there.
Okay, and I think we have maybe one more question, because recognizing we're almost out of time, from Evan. Given that now we have a state law that requires our commissioners to be trained, and in affordable housing being one of the topics, do either of you have any thoughts or suggestions about resources? Because we're as town staff, in many cases, we're going to have to find these opportunities for our commissioners.
The CHRO certainly provides a lot of training. We do an extensive amount of free training throughout the state on various issues. We train businesses on discriminatory practices. We train on fair housing. We have quarterly fair housing training available to the public. This year it's been virtual. And I would assume that we would be happy to be involved in this kind of commissioner training as well. We would be pushing for as much training as possible. There are folks like realtors, there's concern about, do they know about the state law? Are they only learning about federal fair housing law? So there's a lot of issues that we know that folks need more education on, and we're here to provide that as much as possible.
Great, thank you. I think, noting that we're just a couple of minutes before noon, I think it's probably a good place to leave off. And once again, I don't know if I'll let maybe Rebecca wrap things up, but just wanted to thank our panelists, Jody Walker-Smith, Spencer Hill, certainly Representative McCarthy-Vahey, and my co-chair, Emmeline Harrigan, for participating and sharing a lot of really, really important information and some hope for the future. We will continue to work forward. And I'll sign off. I don't know, Rebecca or Evan, I'll let you guys have the last word.
Thank you, John, and thank you to all of our panelists and to CHRO and Representative McCarthy-Vahey. This was a really good session, and I would just like our members to know that we will be looking to potentially do some in-person sessions in the fall. And we do expect to be getting more information out there, especially as things may happen in the special session that is expected in the next couple of weeks. So with that, thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.